Hi, this is Silvana Rodriguez, and I'm with New America, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be talking about sustainable financing that is needed to get digital public infrastructure, or DPI for short, off the ground. Now, DPI is a term that's been coming up quite a bit in recent weeks at the G20 in India, around the UNGA gatherings in New York, and at the IGF in Kyoto. But you might still be asking what exactly DPI refers to. So just to get on the same page, in the same way that our physical infrastructure, things like roads and electricity, need to be effective, safe, and accessible to everyone to help us get where we're going and to power our economies, we need the same kind of digital rails in the digital realm. So DPI refers to the digital systems that enable some core functions at the societal level that power public service delivery and also private sector innovation. Some of the most common functions we talk about tend to be identity verification and digital payments and secure data exchange, but there are many others. So in general, DPI should be interoperable and secure. It should be built on open standards that promote things like universal access. And it should also have some element of governance that enables innovation, inclusion, and competition. When this kind of DPI is in place and when it's working together, it can really power an infinite number of solutions, anything from e-commerce to healthcare management and to government services and far beyond. And while a lot of these concepts are not new, this comprehensive DPI approach can be really helpful for inclusion because you're essentially helping to bring people in from the informal economy and have secure access to things like setting up a bank account, registering a business, getting a business license, helping facilitate the payments they need that are so important for income generation, helping build credit, and beyond. Now, several of the panelists that we have today came together late last year to publish a joint report on sustainable financing for DPI. You can find the link on our session's webpage. And our panel today is an excellent example of cross-sector collaboration because the public in DPI doesn't necessarily refer to who is paying for DPI, it's referring to the public benefit and the public access. So from the private sector, today we have Fernando Morera from EY, which is one of the report co-authors. From the nonprofit side, we have co-author Jordan Sandman from CoDevelop, and from the multilateral side, we have Anders Ejerskov from the World Bank Group, who was kind enough to provide some expert feedback on the report. So let's get started. My first question today is for Fernando. Now, especially last year, this whole DPI space was still a little bit more in the early days, and we had some awareness that financing was a gap, but there wasn't really a lot of information out there about financing specifically for DPI. So Fernando, how did you start approaching this space?
Yeah, absolutely, Silvana. Thank you very much for the warm intro. It's a pleasure to be here. In our paper, we identified 6 funding sources that, in the interest of time, I'll group into 3 main categories. The first one is philanthropic-led capital, meaning you have a philanthropic actor such as a foundation leading the way into the financing mechanism itself. The second model is government-led public infrastructure, and the third one relates to diverse funding streams. So you'll see in the screen some of the models that we uncover in the paper. Again, 6 categories. I group them into 3: philanthropic-led, government-led, and diverse funding streams. An example of a philanthropic-led model is the Moja Loop Foundation, which is the legal entity that it's managing the Moja Loop initiative. Moja Loop essentially is a digital payments platform that is currently being deployed in Rwanda and Tanzania. And the way the model is financed involves donors' contributions on the one hand, and then membership fees on the other. Meaning, there are organizations that are part of the initiative that pay a membership fee, and they participate in the initiative through this private foundation. The second model relates to public funding of digital public infrastructure, and here we can have a single government bring money into or resources into an initiative, all multi-government initiatives forming a consortium to actually build and deploy DPI. An example of a single government is Aadhaar, which is India's digital identity platform that has benefited hundreds of millions of Indians as a result of giving them access to digital identity on the one hand, and on the other hand, allowing a number of financial services to be rendered to these citizens, such as accessing bank accounts, accessing subsidies when they needed it the most. For example, early on in the COVID-19 pandemic, the government needed to reach these citizens, and essentially they access these subsidies through as a result of this digital identity platform. I won't cover all the models here, and I will leave a few of them for folks in the audience to read in our report. But then moving into diverse funding streams, here we typically have an academic institution or a multilateral organization that acts as an orchestrator of a financing ecosystem. So we have an example called DHIS2, which stands for District Health Information System 2. Here we have the University of Oslo acting as an orchestrator of a funding ecosystem and receiving donations or funding from other sectors and other actors, such as CDC, Centers for Disease Control in the United States, the World Health Organization, as well as development agencies such as NORAD. So we have a lot of funding models that we identified. We cover three main categories here. And there are a number of pros and cons related to each of them, which we will cover in a second.
Great, thank you, Fer. So what I'm seeing here is one size does not fit all, and there's a lot of trade-offs. So kind of a follow-on question to that is, how did you weigh those trade-offs against some of the more structural challenges when it comes to financing?
Yes, absolutely, Silvana. That's a great question. So going back to the three-part framework that I presented before, each of these funding mechanisms have pros and cons. So for example, for the philanthropic-led funding, one of the advantages of this funding model is that it's the speed. You get foundations coming together, or a single foundation being able to provide seed capital that it's nimble in nature, and you're able to actually get an initiative off the ground fairly quickly, okay? But the negative side of that funding model relates to the fact that it's usually not enough to scale the initiative beyond the pilot stage, and usually suffers from what we identify in the paper as pilotitis, meaning the inability of a project to move beyond the pilot stage. If you go to the government-led category of funding, here you have capital that is typically suitable for later stage of development and being able to access population scale and being able to deploy the solution well beyond the borders of a country, for example, or well beyond the borders of a simple pilot. But then, the trade-off is that it's usually slow. It relates to the fact that it's subject to procurement process. Some of them are outdated, some of them are siloed, and it's usually very slow to get an initiative very quickly off the ground. The other disadvantage of government-led funding sources that usually, when we think about DPI, it's not only the needs of any specific country, but also how that platform can be reused and can benefit other jurisdictions around the world. So sometimes a government may not have the political appetite to really scale a solution beyond its borders, and that's another disadvantage of government-led capital. And the last category, which relates to diverse funding streams, this is kind of like a very good solution to coordinate different funding sources, but the coordination in and of itself requires a lot of heavy lifting, and a lot of political infrastructure to actually pull this off. It's about harvesting the needs at the local country level, then scaling that needs at the regional level, and then involving a supranational authority, could be a multilateral organization, could be an academic institution with a global footprint, to actually raise awareness of DPI needs across multiple sectors and multiple countries. And that coordination in and of itself it's really, really complex. So on the one hand, you have like multiple data sources, multiple funding sources, but coordination can be a real challenge in the last category that I just mentioned.
Okay. So lots of challenges that we're seeing up here on the screen. And now, Jordan, if you could help me out here, once you had that space mapped out a bit, what kind of conclusions or recommendations did you draw from that for DPI specifically?
Thanks so much, Silvana, and great overview, Fer. If we could go to the next slide, that would be fantastic. This team put together 3 main recommendations out of our report from our research. And I'll wait to get the slide up here, but just a brief overview. The first one is a unified funding mechanism. The second is developing self-sustaining business models for digital public infrastructure. And the third is an open marketplace. So I'll briefly review these. So as Fer mentioned, there's a problem of pilotitis in this space. It's that as we deploy digital public infrastructure, we're looking to build population scale technologies that reach entire countries. But oftentimes when there are donors deploying digital infrastructure, they only might have the funding to do a pilot and then lack the ability to scale that to something that's useful for an entire country, be it an identity system or a payment system that benefit from networks that go across entire countries. So we recommended a unified funding mechanism to tackle the problems of the shared incentives of donors, as well as the lack of scale funding in this space to reach that population scale goal. So what we suggested was that donors and governments create bridging architecture to actually nudge this boulder and combine resources to actually move the needle in this space. And in some ways de-risk before other big funders like the World Bank, which we have Anders here to discuss, and other funders come in and bring the big dollars to set the countries up. There's also there's various incentives that different funders have. So whereas a donor fund may be just looking for impact, a country government might want to fund a digital public infrastructure or a digital public good that works within its borders, but not have the incentives to scale that to other places. And what we know is if you build a digital public good, you can build technology infrastructure that can be easily replicated and scaled to other places. So a unified funding mechanism could help share incentives and pool funds to help collaborate across countries. The second is self-sustaining business models. So this is kind of a persistent problem we've seen in the digital public infrastructure space, that governments that want to adopt a digital identity system or a digital payment system to help include and new populations and streamline their government services can often easily pay for proprietary tech models. But these can sometimes be, clunky, expensive, create things like vendor lock-in, and yet they can't pay for open source solutions. They expect open source solutions to be free, or they don't really understand how to pay into the nonprofit foundation that might host an open source solution. Despite the amount of success that we've seen from models like Linux, which is a foundational pillar of the internet, and other open source tools that are kind of clearly really important and usable in critical contexts. And so what we've seen is their governments and other funders have not been able to find the funds to sustain even small investments. Like for example, the Pix platform in Brazil, I believe, only cost about $5 million to deploy, and their method for building a sustaining business model is to charge, I think, something like 1 cent on every 50 transactions that happens. So it's not that these systems are very expensive, but there needs to be some business model to recoup assets and to help governments actually pay into more human-centered and locally owned solutions. And the final recommendation we had was an open marketplace. So we saw that there was a challenge where certain groups have the social capital to engage with governments to understand where demand is coming for these systems. And other groups had very strong technology, but there's kind of a lack of transparency in the space of what governments need the support and who has the potential technology. So we suggested creating an open marketplace to expand the tent and help connect supply and demand. We've seen groups like DIAL, the Digital Impact Alliance, begin some of this work to build a marketplace that would bring that bridging into place, but there's still more work that needs to be done here. So I'll pause there and hand it back to Silvana.
Thank you, Jordan. That was incredibly helpful. I'm going to come back to these recommendations in just a minute. But quickly, I wanted to ask Anders a question. Now, Anders, when you reviewed an early draft of the report, you had some great feedback on what was missing. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what some of those gaps were. And if you could also maybe help us understand the role that financial institutions like the World Bank could play here.
Thank you very much, Sylvania, and thank you for inviting me. Let me just focus around 3 points. Why has financing not been forthcoming on DPI? And I think one reason is nobody asked for the money. So when we're talking to some of our clients, they haven't really thought about how digitization can help them achieve what they need to achieve, right? So the ask was never even made. Why not? They didn't have the capacity, they didn't have the insight, they didn't have the access to the kind of knowledge you need in order to reinvent how you do your business. And that's across all sectors, healthcare, education, so on. Second is the business case was not made. So the successful institution go and say, if you give me this amount of money, I can save you this much, or I can give you this much in revenue, what be it, right? So that's a second thing. Third is, of course, there are some disincentives. Some stakeholders don't like these digital systems because they come with transparency and often compliance built in. So I think that's one reason. Second is, when we look at financing, it also depends on what we're financing. So for example, take my country, Denmark. Back in the 90s, we introduced electronic medical journals, which means that if I get sick in another part of the country, you can just pull it up rather than wait, say it's on a weekend, I get sick till Monday and then call the doctor up and he will go and check his files, right? So who's going to finance that? Well, the government could finance the basic storage of the journals and the privacy protections and so on, but maybe private companies could go and develop tailored solutions for the individual health practitioners. Another example is on credit cards. So if I'm in the US, I'm going to apply for a credit card. I have to give a copy of my pay stubs, print out from my accounts. I need an employer verification letter and so on. Well, if you go to Norway, what you do is the credit card company will say, do you allow your tax authority to share a little bit of information with me? And then you say yes, and then send it immediately to them. You don't have to spend time on it. And the person in the credit card company doesn't have to go through PDFs, right? It lowers the risk for the company and they can provide you a better deal. But you need, of course, to have an ecosystem you set up where the public and the private sector plays together, or where I, as an individual, I feel safe in terms of how my data is shared, right? So if we move forward, my third point is, how do we do this? Well, it is really a public-private partnership. So 2 components I think are needed. One is the government, together with the private sector and civil society, needs to lay out a vision for what we want to do in a sector, right? Secondly, they need to build the mechanisms for the private sector to come in and help, right? In the PPP world, which is public-private partnerships, companies can come and say, well, we'll offer to build a power plant there. Well, why can't we have that in the digital domain? Where companies are saying, we could build and operate this infrastructure. Are you willing to entertain that, right? So we need to have those instruments in order to move forward with this agenda. Thanks.
It's really helpful, and it's interesting because one of the key pieces I'm hearing from this is that in order for this to work, there has to be an enabling ecosystem. And there's so many different parts that play into it, and each sector sort of has their part to play. So maybe that might help us segue into the next question, which is, it has now been 10 months since we published these recommendations. And my question for you is, have we seen any movement in the financing space? Because it has been a busy year for DPI. From where you sit today, do these still feel appropriate and relevant? And that question could be for any of our panelists.
I'm happy to jump in. And I think Anders makes some great points that I'll sort of touch on here. I think the biggest movement is that people are beginning to realize that this software infrastructure, as Anders laid out, to share data or to make payments is as critical as broadband to the operation of a modern society. And it's just something that everyone's beginning to demand. We've seen a ton of movement in the funding space, as well as just among the major institutions. So at the United Nations General Assembly, as you laid out, Silvana, we had DPI announced as one of the UN Development System's top 12 focus areas for high impact. as well as the launch of a DPI safeguards initiative, where the UN Tech Envoy is helping boost, inclusion and safeguards through a multilateral process. We saw at the G20 the announcement of the One Future Alliance, which is ostensibly going to be a fund, as well as a collaboration that's ongoing now as we move the G20 presidency to Brazil. You've seen funders really double down, both with the creation of CoDevelop, which is where I work, and it's a fund, a nonprofit fund, I should say, that is devoted to the global dissemination of digital public infrastructure, as well as a whole new vertical created by the Gates Foundation. And then finally, you're just seeing a lot more country demand. We're seeing countries saying, I want this for my population because, as Anders laid out, it's just highly efficient. It's what consumers are expecting from their governments to deliver next generation public administration. So countries are moving to adopt these things. It's a question of how can we respond as the ecosystem that's helping to drive these systems, and to do it in a safe and inclusive way.
Any other comments? I'm very curious if, given some of these developments that Jordan has laid out, if this in any way changes or tweaks some of the recommendations that were developed late last year? Or do you think they all still hold pretty clear?
You know what I think you should do? I think you should take some of the business cases and go and knock on the government's door. Let me give you an example. So I looked into the cost of selling houses in the US compared to other countries. And depending on which country you compare with, it's 2 to 3% higher as a percentage of the cost of your house in the US compared to other countries, right? That is like 40 to $60 billion you could potentially save, right? I think digital is part of that. So anybody who has gone through the whole mortgage thing with spending a whole hour just signing papers, there has to be savings there, right? So we think something needs to be done there. Where do you go? Which door do you knock on in the US government, right? I don't know, right? Are the people against it? Probably, but somebody needs to take up that fight. So I think we need to go below the DPI and figure out specific types of infrastructure and really put the business case forward and see what the reaction is. I just don't think anybody has done it. Maybe I'm wrong.
And I think you're right, and that maybe points to one of the challenges that I think was pointed out a little bit earlier, which was essentially when you're looking at a foundational layer that's sort of cross-sector, it's hard to get people motivated about it and to get the incentive for people to invest in it. You have to make it something that that sort of touches their daily life for it to make any sense, or their pocketbook, one or the other.
Otherwise, politicians will just not support it.
Yeah,
All
and
right.
one point there is, I think the land titling industry in the US is $1 billion industry because we have paper records going back centuries. There's no way to prove exactly digitally who owns what. So that's a perfect example of, getting a clear registry that shows who owns what is highly, highly valuable, to Anders' point.
Well, so a bit to this point, one of the big challenges that keeps coming up when we talk about this is how do you align incentives among stakeholders? And often when we think about something like return on investment, we automatically think about the private sector, right? But, I'm going to point out that in the models that you pointed out earlier, Fed, the private sector was not mentioned as one of the majority funders of the existing DPI examples that we looked at, and that some of the big examples that are out there. So a question I have is, what role does the private sector have to play here? And thinking more broadly, how do we move the needle in thinking about incentives or return on investment for the different stakeholders that need to be involved in order for DPI to take off?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic question, Silvana. And, I think one of the key lessons learned from our report is that you need to align the right investor to the right stage of development of the DPI project to give the right incentive to that specific investor, right? So that alignment is critical. So reflecting on your point in the question related to the private sector, the way I think about private sector involvement in these DPI endeavors is across three main categories. You can have the private sector as a philanthropist, meaning contributing resources, donating time, money to a DPI-related endeavor. And there is volumes of research showing that when the private sector philanthropically contributes to, for example, open source initiatives, There is a direct impact on increased productivity, employee retention. So there is an implicit ROI that comes with playing an active philanthropic role vis-a-vis DPI endeavor. That's role number one, philanthropic involvement. The second one that was developed by Anders in this presentation is the role of private sector in the context of public and private partnerships. And there are a number of structures that have been time tested in the market vis-a-vis public infrastructure. So typically you have what is called an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, that is created by a private sector company, and you have two main components there. Number one is equity investors, and then debt that is also used to finance the public infrastructure project. In the equity investor, that's a great opportunity to involve and diversify the risk, right? So typically you have construction companies, engineering companies, infrastructure management companies, and the famous private equity arm of the endeavor. So you can see how the private sector can actually have a direct participation in this SPV. And then you also have the debt component, which is typically involves commercial banks, bonds, multilateral organizations lending money to the SPV in and of itself, and institutional investors such as sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and a bunch of other actors that can also participate through the SPV. And there is a clear alignment of incentives because the equity investors will want an ROI, and the debt also has a direct ROI linked to the retribution of capital that is being invested into the endeavor. And then the SPV can have a contracting relationship with the government, right? And that's how the government chimes in, and the government can also receive funding from a multilateral organization such as the World Bank, and that funding is used to pay the SPV. And the ROI is essentially the cost of the capital being deployed versus the payment that the government is making to the SPV, and that's the ROI for the different stakeholders involved. That's another model. And the third one that I've been seeing in the market, it's a very interesting one that involves non-profit involvement with a for-profit arm. It's sort of a hybrid non-profit for-profit. So you may have typical example of a philanthropy or a non-profit entity kicking off DPI endeavors, and because they need to scale, of course, they need to bring some external capital to the table. And I've seen these, capped profit models where you have a non-profit that it's, essentially invest owning a DPI initiative, and then you have a separate entity in the form of a partnership created underneath the non-profit, and the partnership is open to private sector investors to actually put capital on the table. And depending on when they invest in the initiative, meaning, at early stages of development, the ROI is typically greater, and you have kind of like a trenched participation based on the level of investment from private sector investors, as well as, the timing of that investment. To make a long story short, there are three different, ways the private sector can be involved here: philanthropically, through public and private partnerships, and then through these, for-profit, non-profit structures.
What about for the other sectors? So we talked a little bit about how the private sector is thinking about return on investment, but do we have any thoughts about some of the other sectors that need to be involved, or sort of how you align incentives there?
Yeah, absolutely. And it really depends on the stage of development, right? For the nonprofit sector, it's typically mostly related to the social license to operate, right? How do you get that? And the social return on investment. When you're talking about DPI, that's very easy to measure. For multilateral organizations, of course, you have a financial arm, a component that they need to get remunerated for the capital they're putting together. So typical examples through the PPP. So there is a clear ROI there attached to their investment. I guess, and for the private sector, depending on how you're evaluating the participation, philanthropic participation has a direct impact in their productivity. So it doesn't necessarily reflect into a financial ROI directly, but employees are more engaged. They're developing know-how derived from this participation in the system, and that can actually boost productivity in the long run.
Thank you so much, Ferda. I see that we are wrapping up our final minute here, so I just wanted to say thank you very much to all of our panelists, Fer, Anders, Jordan. And I also want to let our audience know that if you want to check out the report in more detail, you have the link there on the session webpage. It gets into a lot more stuff, but there's more coming up in the next year, so please join us in thinking more about the sustainable financing. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Silvana.
Thank you.